of the CCSS's Qualitative and Interpretive Research Institute. We are very excited today to have a workshop and talk entitled Big Data Meets Thick Description. But first, I want to give just a couple of quick reminders. So next Friday, October 14th, is the due date for our QuIRI small grants and working group applications. So just as a reminder, all PhD students, research associates, and faculty are eligible for these. If you have any questions, please shoot me an email or check out our website. But I hope that you will take advantage of these programs. It's a great way to get some additional support for your research. So today, as I mentioned, the title of our workshop is Big Data Meets Thick Description, Thinking Interpretively with Computational Data. Our seminar leaders are Aspen Russell, who is an information science PhD student in the social media lab here at Cornell, and a data science fellow at the Cornell Center for Social Sciences. She studies toxicity on social media, online forums, and live streaming platforms. Also with us leading the seminar is Chelsea Butkowski. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Center on Digital Culture and Society at the Annenberg School for Communication at UPenn. She received her PhD in communication from Cornell just this past summer, so we are very excited to welcome her back. Chelsea studies social identity and media technologies using a combination of qualitative and quantitative research methods. So please join me in welcoming them today.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Lee. That was an awesome introduction. And I know that we're both stoked to be here, especially I want to give a shout out to Lee, who kind of identified both Chelsea and myself and were like, this whole thing about quote unquote small data needs to be addressed. Can we do something about this? Can we build this conversation and think a bit more critically and add complexity to the conversation? So that's kind of where a lot of this got started. But without further ado, let's get going. So the first thing that I want to do is do a land acknowledgement. Yes, I know this has kind of been part of like the neoliberalization of what academia is, but what I want to focus on is two things. So one, understanding the historical facets of where Cornell is, which land they sit on, which is the traditional and current homeland of the Gaikona or Cayuga Nation, who are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is an alliance of 6 sovereign nations who have that historical and current presence, right? We just have to be cognizant that they have outlasted Cornell, the United States, and we're the first peoples of this land. But aside from kind of just having a historical acknowledgement of who we are and what we're doing here, remembering that colonization is an act. It's a verb. It is ongoing, right? So I am sitting in a department on Cornell whose lighting I am taking advantage of, whose water sources when I fill up my water bottle, whatever it is, the mineral rights that are on this land, the fact that Indigenous students are not automatically enrolled and given free tuition and all these types of things. These are ongoing problems that we are all a part of when we attend a university on Indigenous land in North America. So I just want to keep that in mind about who we are and what we bring to this space, to kind of positionality of what a land acknowledgement is. Okay. Oh yeah. And if you're curious, we're going to share these slides. There's a history of Cornell's land here, the movement to return native land, and the ACE program here at Cornell. Lee kind of already gave this overview, but I'll just give a quick, maybe more narrow version of it, and then Chelsea will introduce herself. So again, PhD student here, specifically working on online communities and toxicity. And for the idea of kind of this mixed method work, which this workshop is focused on, I've worked with Reddit data, Twitter, Facebook, unfortunately, Archive, YouTube, and a flurry of other ones here and there. I also give a big data and APIs workshop series through CCSS if you want to get hands-on. And I always like this. A fun fact, I've been a dungeon master for Dungeons and Dragons campaigns, which is one of my passions, which Chelsea can actually attest to. But I'd love if Chelsea could introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so yes, as Lee said, thank you for the great introduction. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center on Digital Culture and Society at University of Pennsylvania, recent Cornell alum. And yeah, I study how people use digital media technologies to understand and make sense of their own identities within a lot of major political events. And so the types of data that I've mostly worked with, I've looked a lot at Twitter and the Twitter API, a little bit on Facebook Live. And I really am passionate about thinking about methods we can use to study people and phenomena across social media and online platforms. And I, along with playing Dungeons and Dragons with Aspen, am also an aspiring maker of stained glass art and trying to learn to become a side hustle stained glass artist. We'll see. Anyway, that's me. Great to see everyone. And just to talk you through what we're going to be doing today, our agenda today is to give you an introduction, a taste, some sparks and excitement about the idea of integrating interpretive and computational methods. One of those things, whether it be interpretive or computational, may be less familiar to you. But our goal here is to show you how they can be brought together, how they can be used to think together, and how they're already, in fact, complementary approaches to doing research. And so we're going to start today by giving you some definitions, walking you through some research designs that we have personally done. Although we're not going to be teaching you about individual methods in extreme detail today, we will hopefully give you enough of a taste to start thinking about how these methods could be relevant to your own research. We'll show you some tools, considerations, and practical things to think about, as well as where you can learn more about applying these methods. And then we'll take a brief opportunity to do some brainstorming and smaller group discussion about how these methods could be applied or how you react to these methods in relation to your own research. And then we'll leave a few minutes at the end for general question and answer among everyone. So that's where we're at today.
Okay, so definition work, right? And just to clarify, we're going to go over 3 or 4 terms. This isn't to say that they are the right or the ground, whatever it is about them. We just want to have a consistent definition that we can come back to. It's fine to critique them. It's fine to have a different one. Just remember that when we engage with discussions, we need a definition to kind of move forward with, so we can all just kind of level the playing field and kind of move forward. So one of those, which is in the title of this talk, is big data. What is big data? What is big enough? What is large? What is small? A very difficult question to ask. So I'll give 2 perspectives. So the one that you're seeing on screen is kind of the computational social scientist, or kind of the quantitative online digital studies definition of what big data is. And this is by Lazer and Radford, David Lazer and Radford. They are huge names in the computational social science kind of methodological sphere, very famous in popularizing methods alongside people like Matt Salganik. So I'll just read this off real quick and then give the secondary definition. So big data represents the data being generated by the digitization of social life. So this is really to say that once we introduce these massive platforms that became centralized and used by hundreds of millions and now billions of people, what does that mean? And the outcome is big data. The second definition comes from more the technical computer science data engineering perspective, and that is the 5 V's, which are volume, velocity, variety, veracity, and value. So you can kind of understand why these 2 delineating definitions exist for the kind of practicality of the work that you do. My personal view is obviously somewhere in the middle, but probably leaning more towards the social science by saying it's a coping mechanism, right? These technologies came before we could really expect them, account for them, or prepare them for things like social science or humanities-based research. So we use big data as kind of this catch-all term to cope with the fact that we can't really understand, grasp, or visualize the onslaught of data being distributed, generated, and collected every single day. So we need that term to kind of help us out. One note that I want to make is about trace data versus data exhaust. So Tornberg and Udermark have this amazing paper, it is linked in the slide deck, about methodological pluralism and the validity and generalizability of computational studies. And one of the most important critiques that they make is about the difference between social scientists who tend to use the term behavioral trace data, Lazer, Radford, Salganik, versus kind of more critical data studies humanities folks who have brought forth this idea of data exhaust. So what kind of industry researchers, large-scale quantitative social scientists, their investment in these data is to say, when you use Facebook and you leave a comment, when you use Facebook and you leave a like, when you watch a YouTube video and share it, these are clean behavioral traces of an intention that you had as a user. And therefore, we can aggregate them and say something really interesting about humanity more broadly. Data exhaust is a critique of that, saying that the data traces that you see on social media are an accident. They're a byproduct. They need to be scoped, right? They cannot be highly generalizable because they exist within the affordances of a platform, and that humans and these platforms were never meant for social science or humanities studies. And obviously, both of these definitions get to exist in conversation with each other, but we just need to be clear about what realities we are actually working with when we do the social science work at hand. And this data exhaust is a great term to bring that critique into the conversation.
Why did I mute myself? Anyway, so now I will get us toward a term that those of us who are coming at this from the Qualitative and Interpretive Research Institute may be a little more familiar with, though if you are not familiar with it, that is completely okay. So thick description is an approach that looks at the close attention and contextualization of social phenomena and meaning. And it draws from the work of anthropologist Clifford Geertz. It's a very famous and well-known term that in some ways has kind of become a catch-all, which is part of why it was an effective part of a title for this talk, to describe the intense attention to context and interpretation when looking at social phenomena, looking at behavior, and examining how we make and understand meaning through various kinds of interaction and data. And so that helps to inform the way that we might interrogate big data. But then this begs the question, if we have big data, what about small data? What about little data? And this is a topic that has started to surface a little bit in some social scientific conversations about big data, internet research, large data repositories, and how they can be studied through qualitative and interpretive methods. And there's the suggestion that when we use qualitative and interpretive methods to study digital data, that can constitute kind of the opposite of big data. It can constitute small data. But I think we want to distance ourselves a little bit from this idea in the sense that if anyone here has conducted a qualitative research project, you know that qualitative research produces massive volumes of data, huge amounts of data, from transcripts to memos, to notes, to the constellations of coding and other processes that we engage in to examine qualitative data and collect and analyze it. And so a key thing to think about here is not so much big data versus small data as a form of qualitative inquiry, but rather thinking about the richness of what qualitative and interpretive methods can offer computational data.
All right, well, that brings us to this question. We kind of know what big data is. We know what thick description is. So how do we place these within this means to a social science or humanities end, which is this computational methodology? There are a lot of different ways to kind of understand what computational means. Again, there's kind of a spectrum going from the more social scientists to the more technical and engineering spaces. But the definition that I've settled on, the one that I've written here today, is one that I think captures it pretty darn well. So I'll just read it out real quickly and then kind of explain where I'm coming from. So computational social science is social science that requires the use of data too large to manually manage and or where the computer is integral to the social science inquiry. So this kind of answers two questions, right? When the data is too big and we're coping with it and we're using this term big data, we physically can't understand, grasp, or really make too much of an ends from it. That's one category in which computational is definitely viable. But the second one is, I think, often left out, right? This idea that we have to use the computer, whether it's for analysis, whether it's for cleaning, whether it's for acquisition with APIs, and it's integral to the idea of a social science methodology, to the idea of a social science end, an analysis, an outcome, right? And that has a lot of different forms. So I like to think of it as more of a fluid central space that is neither quantitative nor qualitative, is neither inductive nor deductive. It is a means to work with new populations, new types of data, new spaces, and also to have a different relationship to these spaces, as we'll learn further on about spaces that may be so large and so thin, but you are allowed, the barrier to entry is much lower or different than more traditional spaces like surveys or interviews. So just learning and adding this to your toolkit to answer different types of questions or to answer the same questions from different areas. That's how I like to frame like computational methodologies in this kind of social science space.
Okay, so wow. When I started working with computational data, social media data, digital data, like all of these terms confused me so much that felt like a barrier of entry to me. So I hope that just even getting some basic definitions can help us to get started with this conversation. And also there may still be terms that we need to clear up, so we can definitely talk about that during brainstorming and Q&A as well. Or if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But now that we have some terms, let's talk about what kind of data we actually even mean when we talk about computational data. And there are so many examples, as Aspen was saying, the volume and scale and scope of computational data, digital data that is currently being produced has rapidly accelerated, even though we've been producing data for the entire history of, humankind. But some computational data that we're typically concerned with when we're talking about this in terms of social scientific, digital humanities, and other areas of inquiry is thinking about some basic examples like tweets sampled from a hashtag or a user's profile or a collection of user profiles that could be from hundreds to thousands to millions of tweets, or all the comments on a particular YouTube video, conversations in a subreddit or Facebook group. And these are some pretty social media focused examples, but you can also look beyond that to things like Google reviews, or even in some cases, the text of a series of books or scripts. So anything that is a big data set can become something we could analyze depending on access, ethics, methods, many other questions, but there's a lot out there. So there are an array of computational methods that we can use to analyze this kind of data. Things like content analysis and topic modeling that use automated systems in order, and there, let me say, when I say content analysis, there are many different kinds of content analysis. There's manual content analysis, qualitative content analysis, textual analysis, but there's also automated computational content analysis that can be used on large data sets to try to automatically make sense of the patterns and trends going on in the data without human coders, but rather AI coders. There's also things like network analysis, looking at the relationships between social networks and groups tied together by various different kinds of links, detection, classification, sentiment analysis, many more. We're not going to go into extreme depth on these methods, but just to give you an idea of the kinds of methods we're talking about. But we want to talk here about how these kinds of methods can be meaningfully combined, related, connected, tied together with various interpretive methods that we are possibly more familiar with, from interviewing to discourse and textual analysis, observation and ethnography, focus groups. How can these things have a meaningful and exciting relationship to one another? And how can we reduce the barriers to entry of either of these two kind of approaches?
So yeah, we talked about definitions. We've talked and given some examples of methodologies and kind of the relationship between what we have seen as computational. And one of the things that we want to dispel with this talk is that computational does not equal quantitative, right? I hope that part is becoming more clear, but I also want to flip that and send it into the completely other direction as well, and saying that many computational methods and kind of the core of like large scale or big data analyses are fundamentally reflexive. They're fundamentally exploratory. They're fundamentally well aligned with the ideas and kind of the underpinnings of a lot of qualitative methodologies that learn from the context within which they study, that are connected in this way. Not all computational methods are explanatory or predictive or even machine learning learning driven, right? So many of them, like a topic model, is an automated thematic analysis, right? Not saying one is better than the other, but just saying I think that the way that we use them, especially for mixed method study of using computational methods to identify trends to create purposive samples, is really, really important, especially I think for people who are more traditional qualitative researchers. So I just want to kind of create that as like a preamble before Chelsea and I give real world examples of what this looks like. So I'm going to talk about a mixed methods project that began computational and is ending more qualitative, and Chelsea will actually show off a very interesting and innovative and new methodology that lives in this kind of computational liminal space, which I really appreciate. So let's talk about codifying strategies of dealing with toxicity online. So this is an ongoing project. We're we're going into just over a year now in the social media lab, looking at big data on YouTube, Reddit, and Twitter. And we have kind of these theoretical constructs, right? When we think of a more traditional quantitative model of identify your theoretical construct, create a bunch of measures, observe the thing, and then run an analysis on whatever data you were allowed to get, we're going to kind of mess with that model quite a bit. So we wanted to ask this question about how people react to toxicity online. So we wanted to look at kind of these open online spaces and look at conversations and dialogue and say, well, we know that hate speech, harassment, and misinformation, or kind of this larger concept of toxicity, exist. But what does it look like? And what forms do they take when we're looking at the intersection of politics or world events or topics that really polarize people? And what do like highly polarized conversations end with? That's what we're really concerned with. Like, can we unlock some key about how conversations end and then provide some explanatory power in the future to understand like what conversations could look like in the future? So we went through this cyclical process that took months and months and months of grabbing some data from particular contexts and scraping them, cleaning them, and then starting to do preliminary coding. So we actually used an abductive coding strategy where we started with two theory-driven constructs of threatening and imploring, and we'd start coding comments for these types of strategies that were existing in dialogue. And then we would move a bunch of these other comments that had some of the features of the theoretical constructs, but weren't quite clear. And we would start inductively coding those, right? We would start separating them, thematically analyzing them, giving them their own names, and then coming back to the source. So we'd actually play with kind of two levers. One was kind of the code book and its iterations and naming conventions, but we would also look at the context within which we're finding the comments that were more likely to hit in our actual code book. And that's what I mean when I talked about earlier about this reflexivity, this returning to community. And one of the huge strengths of kind of computational methods that allow you to get like social media data is the longitudinal facets, the metadata, and these less explicit or less direct forms of communication. So it took us quite a while where we're spending 3 or 4 months just simply going through different contexts and different conversations until we could really find our space. And then the project completely transitioned into what you would better recognize as a traditional qualitative code book, where we were really trying to expand our definitions and try to understand their placement in the world. So I hope that's a better example, and I'm more than happy to talk about it in Q&A or brainstorming about how you can start highly computational exploratory and then kind of form it into a very purposive, intentional code book that you'd see in more qualitative studies.
All right. And for mine, yeah, I've also used some similar methods to that. And I think it's really incredible to be able to access this data. We'll talk more about what that access means and how it works, and then to analyze it qualitatively. And so Aspen, thanks so much for your very nice description of the method that I want to talk about today. So the methodology I'm using is kind of a bottom-up, flipped, turn on its head version of computational research. So after the 2020 US election, Facebook published this blog post that said, well, only 6% of all posts on people's Facebook feeds during the election were political. So Facebook, it's really not that political. Don't worry, everyone. And I had just done a study that made me really laugh at that, because there are lots of things that are weird about that 6%. One, how are they defining political? And two, no one can externally verify whether this 6% of political posts is really what is appearing on people's feeds, because Facebook does not give people access, like researchers or any external investigators, access to the type of content that appears on people's feeds or any opportunity to examine or computationally analyze feed content. And also the third reason that it kind of made me laugh was I was like, who cares about what percentage of the content was political? What about how it feels to experience the social media feed during an election or during a heightened time of political intensity? And so I use this method that involved looking at people's social media feeds alongside them. Because if you think about what a Facebook feed is, it's a personalized, algorithmically tailored space for one individual. And I wanted to look at it with the people that it was designed to be used by. So I was wondering, how do ordinary citizens experience an election through their social media feeds? And so this involved actually an approach that focused on in-depth interviews as the sole and major way of gathering data about what appears on social media. So I asked participants to share their screen during the interviews, of course, with advanced permission and discussion of what that would look like and mean. And we looked at their social media feeds together. And we engaged in a combination of interviews and observational research where the participants served as co-analysts of their social media feeds alongside me, and also kind of analyzed the content that appeared there. And so this didn't involve scraping or pulling data, but rather asking participants to share their data with me in this research environment to circumnavigate the terms of service restrictions from Facebook and the kind of other difficulties of accessing the content that really forms our social media experiences.
Okay, wow, this has been a lot of talking. I swear we have an activity coming up soon. So let's just check in with the work that we've done. We've talked about definitions. We know what big data, thick description, and computational methods are. We've seen some examples. We've seen some real world practical applications of these tool sets and methodologies. So maybe you're on board, or maybe you already were, and you're like, where do I go next? I've heard some of these words, maybe the ones that you've seen on the screen. Perhaps they are your tools of your trade and you're looking to do more social science work. Perhaps these are things that a colleague in a far-flung office somewhere else is kind of doing as a collaborator. I just wanted to do one thing with this slide. This isn't to say, go learn Python in Jupyter Notebooks and use the pandas package. It doesn't say that R is better, so because it's created by academics, and go use tidyverse. The idea is that these are tools. Right. So if you're a social scientist or a humanities person, the idea is that these are means to your social scientific end. Right. This does not need to be your discipline. This does not need to be your everything. This is not your contribution. So you really just need to frame it that way and kind of break down that barrier to just practice with the types of packages that are out there that have been created by social scientists, that have been created by academics, to kind of just help break down those barriers, to get access to these spaces, to do your really high quality, intentional social science work. And in that vein, I just wanted to share this slide. So instead of thinking about it in kind of like that, oh, I have to have Python and this thing called Jupyter Notebooks, and then I have to use all these weird packages to wrangle, millions and millions of comments, is more to think about it this way. I want to work on Twitter. I know that this academic created academic Twitter, and you get to use it more like a query, like you're querying a database, or you're even just like on an online search engine, right? That's what these packages are there for. So the focal point is really you to use your brain to understand what the sample needs to look like, what behavior you're really interested in kind of teasing apart. And I'll just give one more shout out. In the spring, I'll be doing a big data and APIs workshop series, 3 parts, where you'll actually get to use academic Twitter hands-on and start doing some queries for an idea that you have or work in progress. But just remember, if you want to do this work, you absolutely can. And it's not as technical or engineering focused as I think it has the moniker of seeming like.
Yeah, so just to kind of review and discuss some of the ins and outs, challenges and opportunities of engaging with big data, and engaging with these kinds of samples, accessing data through all of these different various platforms and tools that Aspen was mentioning. So big data presents us lots of opportunities. As we've kind of alluded to, you get this quick access to a large repository of data. And what's more, often a challenge in qualitative research can be accessing people who may typically be inaccessible. So giving us a chance to connect with these unknown, typically inaccessible people in large quantities. The processes for collecting and gathering this data are automated, and sometimes also for analyzing it, which can be helped along or aided by qualitative approaches. As well as this, we have this ability with a lot of, with an interview, for example. You're there for that one interview, and you may not have a chance to return back and look back or look forward with a person. Though with ethnography, maybe you do, depending on your approach, but you, with big data, you have this opportunity to return to the past, look to the future of your data. And also you get access to a lot of metadata or background data that provides a data-based, trace-based context on the, for example, a tweet, a comment that you might be interested in. But there are some important caveats, ethical considerations, and challenges that need to be considered when thinking about using big data. And its wonderful accessibility and automation also present some roadblocks and considerations. So for one thing, this big data is often very decontextualized. It is not going to be couched in the discussion and the background and the lived experiences of the person who shared a tweet or liked a post. And it's often not going to be very easy to figure out what that context is. So the method I shared was one attempt to kind of start to contextualize these digital traces, but it's not so easy to find ways to do it. Also, in terms of thinking about the ethics of big data research, there are several things to think about, including, for one, even data that is shared publicly online, especially user-generated content, even if it's public, we have to consider what a person's expectation of privacy might be. When they posted that YouTube comment, did they expect that a researcher would pick that up and then put it into a study, analyze it, and share it again in a research paper? So thinking about what the situated expectation of privacy in the context that you're interested in studying, particularly when individuals are sharing information in a social setting, is really important. And then trying to protect the confidentiality of your participants through and prevent them from being reverse searched or found through your study, I think is very important through things like potentially using pseudonyms, just as you would in another kind of study, or anonymizing photos that you might use, or things like that are really important. And also different platforms have different terms of service that provide a legal kind of background to platform use. Terms of service are not necessarily ethical standards. They are platform standards and governance, and they are designed probably more to protect the platform than any individual users. But they are worth considering when you're looking into going into a new digital space. Also, a few other quick things. Big data is big. It's large. The file sizes are large. There's a lot of data to process, and Cornell has different opportunities and tools you can use to manage the size of large data sets. But your computer may be put to the test with some big data sets. Also, as we said, as Aspen was saying earlier, there's this notion of data exhaust and thinking about just because a digital trace is online, we have to consider, what does this actually mean? What does this actually tell us, and not just take it at face value? And then finally, of course, something that is a big barrier to entry for many and was a big barrier to entry for me was the ability to build skills that are needed for analysis of this kind of data, which is something that luckily Cornell offers a lot of opportunities for.
Yeah, I just want to add two things that came to mind. One is many large-scale platforms have ongoing experiments. So when you do scrape data from these platforms, there's a chance that you're actually getting like A/B test data from some internal researchers. And the second thing is about feature changes. So like when Instagram introduces a different way of filtering or removing people or banning content or not safe for work filters, you may, right, 1 month scrape and do this big study on it, and then the platform fundamentally changes the next one. So these are also two challenges that I just wanted to add in.
So really quick, before we get into our quick brainstorming activity, is even if you're worried about your skills, you already have, if you're doing, let's say, qualitative or interpretive research, you have many transferable skills that can be transferred to computational context. For one, inductive reasoning is actually really important in both a lot of qualitative inquiry as well as computational inquiry, because a lot of times this research in with big data is going to be exploratory, not knowing what will come up in these data sets, and analyzing them, breaking them down, exploring what's there is relatively similar to approaches like grounded theory and what have you, which can be applied to these kinds of data as well. And then also, we are accustomed to uncovering patterns, coding, looking at connections. Also, as I said, qualitative data produces large amounts of data as well. So data management is a skill that you probably already have. And most importantly, qualitative research is very skilled at transparency and telling stories, both through the methods and through the data that is collected. And that is a very important skill to doing computational research. So we are going to take a few minutes, probably about like 5 or 6 minutes to brainstorm. Oh, wait, no, we have time. We have 10 minutes, right? We do. About 10 minutes to brainstorm in 2 breakout rooms. So Aspen and I, one of us will be in each room. And so we want to keep this a pretty, low impact, relaxed brainstorm. So we're going to discuss in these breakout rooms, how might you consider using these kinds of methods? Do you have ideas, works in progress where you could apply these methods? Or how do you even react to these methods? What do you think? How do you feel about them? How do you respond? So no pressure to have a project in mind, but in relation to your own research, your own background and discipline, how do you respond and react? Or what possibilities do you potentially see with these kinds of methods? So if that sounds okay to everyone, we'll break out into rooms for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and kind of share a couple minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So I think, great, let's go. So
yeah, I think that might be a good avenue for me to go down. Definitely want to talk to you about it more, of course, but no, I think that's such a great idea for this.
Yeah, okay, we're back. So welcome back, everyone. We do only have like 7 minutes left. So we're going to open it up for some discussion. Maybe before we open up for discussion, Aspen, we should just show the next steps, and then we can open general discussion Q&A.
Yes, so let's just get through this really quickly, and then we can start Q&A. Also, first off, thank you so much for being participatory. It's great to actually see people's faces and like have a human connection and not lecture for the entire time. So thank you. So yeah, you saw some tool sets, you saw some packages that feels very ephemeral, like it's just a slide on some person's computer somewhere in the world. So where can you learn these things? So I'll give a shout out to the Summer Institute in Computational Social Sciences. This is targeted at graduate students and new faculty, assistant faculty. It was created by Matt Salgonic and Chris Bale, Princeton and Duke University, and it's all free and open source. So all of their lectures, free. All of their pedagogical materials, free. And if you have 2 weeks to spare during the summer, you can join one of their boot camps, which exist around the world. I did mine at UCLA. I've had friends who did theirs at Princeton and Rutgers. So it's 2 weeks of intensive lectures, discussions, workshops, and then applied project work in computational methods. So if you just want 2 weeks, just nonstop getting this information, highly recommend. The next is the Cornell Center for Social Sciences. I'm a data science fellow. You can do a couple of different things. We have workshops like the Big Data and APIs workshop. Python, R, all of those things, and consultation. Shoot me a message, shoot the group a message, and get help to do this work. And then Chelsea will talk about the last one.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that there are also a lot of really amazing open source resources, and not just like, oh, here's an article, but entire textbooks that are very easy to access and are adapted for audiences that are coming in with little to no knowledge of these kinds of methods. And so one textbook that I've used in the at Cornell in the Digital Humanities Initiative is Introduction to Cultural Analytics in Python by Melanie Walsh. And she's a former Cornell postdoc as well. And this textbook is very accessible and easy to read for people coming from various different backgrounds and disciplines. So now maybe in our last 5 minutes, we can open up for a little bit of general discussion, Q&A, and also just generally we'll say thank you to everyone for, like Aspen said, being such great participants, sharing your ideas and reactions and thoughts to the presentation. And we're happy to address further questions, or feel free to contact us later and we can continue the conversation.
I am gonna, well, we can share these slides. I just want to look at people if possible.